Every MetaViews episode, I like sharing some breaking research or interesting technology or invention that's out and about, just so that we can get a sense of what's on the horizon and what's coming next. And so this was sent by one of our MetaViews members who thought that we would get a kick out of this research, and boy, do we ever. Its scientists have created the first ever living programmable organism. I mean, pretty wild concept when you think about it, right? The idea that we can make programmable organisms, which, in the context of a pandemic, does give us a little bit of sense of hope, right? A little bit of sense that maybe instead of always being powerless towards these types of things, that we might actually have a greater opportunity to engage at the molecular level. Of course, that also brings up all sorts of scary things like the mistakes you could make or the monsters you could unleash. But I actually don't want to approach this research from an alarmist perspective. I'd rather approach this research from a curious perspective. Because Moopod, it was funny that you brought up 3D printing, because this is actually an excellent example of 4D printing. In that 3D printing is where you're creating an object, a physical object in 3 dimensions. But 4D printing is when you're creating an object that changes with time. And if you think about it, all living creatures are 4D objects. And so when, let's say, our rabbits reproduce, they're engaged in a kind of 4D printing, right? Because they're creating an object that's later going to grow and evolve. So what if you could program that? What if you could actually create a living creature or an autonomous machine that after you 3D printed it, it started to grow based on air or water or energy? Well, that's kind of the concept behind programmable organisms. That it's kind of like 4D printing, except in this case, you're either programming the DNA or you're doing specific things with specific materials. So in this case, they're talking about a combination of artificial intelligence and biology that produces the world's first living robots. And again, I think living robots is a bit of a misnomer because we're all kind of robotic. And that's why I like the word programmable organism, because it's an organism that we can have a certain sense of predictability as to what it's going to do. Now, again, I don't want to look at this from a fear perspective. They refer to these as xenobots, so I don't want to be xenophobic about the xenobots, but I think it does speak to the future of AI and the future of robotics. To make xenobots, the research team used a computer to test thousands of random designs of simple living things that could perform simple tasks. The computer was programmed with an AI evolutionary algorithm to predict which organisms would likely display useful tasks, such as moving towards a target. After the selection of the most promising designs, the scientists attempted to replicate the virtual models with frog skin or heart cells, which were manually joined using microsurgery tools. The heart cells in these bespoke assemblies contract and relax, giving the organisms motion. The creation of the xenobots is groundbreaking. And despite being described as programmable living robots, they are actually completely organic and made of living tissue. The term robot has been used because xenobots can be configured into different forms and shapes and programmed to target certain objects which they unwittingly seek. So again, on the one hand, you could sort of see how this is futuristic and high-tech and evokes a lot of doomsday scenarios. But I actually think it's not that complicated, and I say that as someone who's involved in agriculture, right? Because there's a reason why our dog Leon has the instinct that he does, which is he wants to protect the livestock. He wants to make friends with the horse, he wants to hang out with the goats, he wants to protect the chickens. And that's because as human beings, we have bred those dogs for hundreds and thousands of years, choosing the characteristics, the traits, the instincts that best serve our purposes. I mean, we're doing it right now in terms of our chickens, that we're putting together a whole bunch of breeds of chickens that sort of work together. And the chickens that survive, they're going to be the custom breed that is best selected for our climate and best selected for our conditions. So, what they're doing here is not so much creating a programmable living organism as they're engaged in the act of natural selection at a much more rapid pace. And further, they're able to combine different traits from different species by hacking the DNA, but it still is fundamentally a kind of trial and error. Now, Merle, since I suspect that you can hear me as a result of tuning into the Twitch, you should check the blades of the snowblower because they look rather gummed up. You might actually need to clear them out before that snowblower is going to be effective. And in doing this, I'm actually jumping ahead to our next section, previewing Merle outside there with the snowblower. But I just saw him out the window, so I, as a programmable organism, had to respond and communicate to the other programmable organism that he had to clear out the snowblower just a little bit. And that is the wonder of technology. But back to my point about these designing reconfigurable organisms, I almost feel as if the description of this research amplifies what they're doing and frames it in a way that makes it seem robotic when in fact the artificial intelligence is more in the research, more in the identifications of the types of genes and the types of species they could combine. So it's not really a robot in the traditional sense, it's just farming. But farming on a microscopic level that allows for microscopic products, hence the name xenobots, microorganisms that might, say, go after hostile viruses, that might eat or create beneficial bacteria. I mean, if you think about the role of farming, farming is partly taking the world of the biome, taking the world of microbiology and translating into our biology and to crops and to vegetation and to animals. Well, now that science is allowing us to go into the meta view of the micro view, well, that's allowing us to not so much program, but select, engage, harvest, cultivate. And so in that sense, I think if we recognize farming as a kind of hacking or farming as a kind of programming, then we're starting to see farming break into even smaller and more precise context, like in this case, really tiny organisms. Now, interestingly enough, there is a video that goes along with this research, and I thought it was worth watching, if only to kind of illustrate what these guys were talking about. So let's take a look. I mean, this is where they're doing the programming, where they're grafting on the different tissues onto different species. So again, part of what makes this possible is new technology and tools that allow us to manipulate things on the microscopic level. It's pretty impressive that Merlatron just won 5 points from the jump catch game. Obviously, it was entirely accidental, but impressive nonetheless as he's outside snowblowing. And I mean, this is also, I think, an interesting video that demonstrates the methodology, that demonstrates the technology. Because this is some, remarkable salad making if they're grafting the skin of a tomato or using heart tissue from a living creature. But you can see why I sort of think of this as farming rather than programming. Because it's much more working with organic materials than it is working with computer code. Lawrence mentioned they look more like potatoes than anything else. And that does speak to how, to Jeanette's point in the seminar, that things look differently depending upon their scale and depending upon their size. But I think part of what we're seeing in this video is the way in which these tissues start to merge and evolve and become a new living organism. Xenobots. Again, I almost feel the story here is not the programmable organism, but the tools that actually make it possible. The tools that allow for this type of surgery and allow for this type of construction. Because the precision here is really quite remarkable. So let's just check out this one report. That didn't have audio. Let's see if this one does. Or if if this is just the same. I do find it interesting that none of these videos have sound. But this is a good illustration of the concept. But I'm still not convinced that they're building something new. It more feels like they're assembling something new. And assembling something new is as simple as putting two different rabbits into the same enclosure. Eventually, they're going to assemble a lot of things new. Right? And again, I have difficulty understanding how this differs from farming or breeding. It's just a whole lot faster, which is not necessarily a good thing. I think the benefits of things going slowly is you have more opportunity to understand their effects. You have more opportunity to understand the dangerous impacts. But it is fascinating research, right? And it does suggest that the role of AI here is not so much in the programming, but managing complex information and helping us sort and organize that information. Because all of a sudden, we'll start entering into an infinite possible number of, combinations of these building blocks, right? You think of Lego and how Lego pieces can be transformed into all sorts of structures. Well, here we're suggesting the same kind of building blocks, but at the molecular level. And so there's near infinite possibilities of combinations and things to assemble. And so it's not that xenobots can be created, right? I think the issue here is not that we can create programmable living organisms, but what kind of programmable living organisms should we make first? What kind of programmable living organisms should we prioritize, right? What are the programmable living organisms that are necessary in a pandemic? What are the programmable organisms that can help end world hunger? What are the programmable living organisms that, help with education? I mean, I'm brainstorming, but you get the idea, right? That I think when we find a new technology, when we make a breakthrough in terms of science, that the next step is to really ask, well, what's the point? What are we going to do with it all? How should society allocate resources to take advantage of this?